Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events. If you've been reading the New York Times for the past couple of decades, you're probably familiar with our guest and his insightful analysis of the players, the teams, and the business of baseball in 21st century America. A Fort Washington native and former pitcher for Germantown Academy, Tyler Kepner started covering baseball as a teenager, interviewing players for a homemade magazine entitled KP Baseball Monthly, some of which I saw being signed earlier. And he wrote that magazine with a couple of buddies in 7th grade. Kepner went on to attend Vanderbilt University on the Grantland Rice Fred Russell Sports Writing Scholarship, then covered the Angels for the Riverside Press and the Mariners for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. He joined the Times in 2000, covering the Mets for 2 seasons, the Yankees for 8, and serving as the national baseball writer since 2010. George Will, author of Men at Work, The Craft of Baseball, writes, one of baseball's enchanting oddities is that the action begins with a member of the defense holding the ball. Tyler Kepner has written a mind-opening explanation of what happens next. Chock full of anecdotes and insights, his book is a masterful dissection of the art and the heart of the game. Please welcome Tyler Kepner.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I've done several of these talks at various libraries in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and that's sort of my adopted home where I happen to live. But this is home, Philadelphia, and I was born in Pennsylvania Hospital in 1975 and grew up in the suburbs and everything. So it's always a treat to come back. And now that the Phillies are good again, I may be coming back a little more. I was here quite a bit in the 07 to 11 run they had here. So I'm looking forward. Somebody asked me if I'm a Phillies fan. I said, well, I like to say that a lot of people I care a lot about the Phillies. So when they do well, it makes my friends and family happy, and they kind of get the idea. In fact, right after the Phillies won the World Series in 08, we're in the press box, and we get back from the clubhouse and writing on deadline, and some fan got access to the press box, and he just opened the door like he was just crazy, and he just yelled out like, "Woohoo, Phillies, awesome, won the World Series!" And then he closed the door, and then this writer from the New York Post said, "Kepner, will you knock it off down there?" So everybody kind of knows where I heart really stands on this stuff. But I've written about them critically as well, because that's what you have to do in this profession. Someone on Twitter the other day had a random comment about because I follow a lot of people who follow baseball history, and they said the 1982 Phillies were kind of a weird team because it was one of those. It was a rare team at that era that didn't make the playoffs. They were pretty good, but not great. And I chimed in. I'm like, if you'd like to talk about the 1982 Phillies, I could talk to you literally all day. That was the first team I ever followed. They didn't make the playoffs, but they marketed themselves as their official slogan that year was baseball's best. So you got to be pretty bold and pretty good to make that your official marketing slogan. But the point is that I was lucky. 1982, my first year following baseball, I was 7 years old. Phillies were 2 years off a championship. They had Pete Rose, who was going to get the all-time hits record. They had Mike Schmidt, who had just won 2 MVPs. They had Steve Carlton, who was about to win his 4th Cy Young Award. They had Tug McGraw, who was the most endearing personality maybe in baseball history. And it was just a magical time. You go down to the vet, there's a giant green furry animal coming around and, giving you hugs and everything. There's fireworks on the 4th of July. And there's not natural grass, and you can't tell where you are, but I didn't really care. It was just Major League Baseball in my hometown, and we could go down there 15, 20 times a year. My dad, luckily, for me, had been in the Army Reserves with Dave Montgomery, so I got to know Dave, who was just the nicest person you ever want to meet in your life. And just getting to know the people in baseball kind of made me think, I might one day be able to be around this world. I tried to play baseball. I played through high school. My friend Mike Daly's down there. I was telling his sons and his daughter, Mike was the fastest pitcher I knew as a kid, and I had really good control. So I was like half a good pitcher, and he was half a good pitcher. But we were both missing a half. But if I had his speed and he had my control, you'd be seeing us in the big leagues now. But so I just love baseball. I loved everything about it. And as you heard, I started a little baseball magazine when I was about 13, 14 years old. And I was just so inspired by the great sports writers of Philadelphia, particularly Jason Stark, who has become a great friend and mentor to me. He's going to the Hall of Fame this year, the Hall of Fame Writers Award. Well-deserved. I said we shouldn't even have an award if Jason doesn't get it. He's the greatest baseball writer who ever lived. I was texting with him today, and I was like, I've gotten past the point of reading a Jason Stark story and being mad because I didn't have the idea. Because I just want to say, like, you know what? I'm reading the best baseball writer who ever lived, and he's a friend of mine, and it's just a privilege. So Jason inspired me a lot by his love of what he did. And that really gave me the another pathway, another sort of possibility for being in baseball. I said, well, what do I do well? I think I can write okay. I enjoy my writing classes at Germantown Academy. I love to read about baseball. What if I tried to write about baseball? So I put together this little magazine with my friends. It got bigger and bigger. The Phillies started letting me in to do interviews when I was 15. So 15, 16, 17 years old, 18, I'm in high school, and then after school or in the summer, I'm going down to the vet just about every day. By my junior year, the Phillies said, like, you're asking for so many daily press passes. Here's a season pass. Come whenever you want. So it was great. I was like, this is my season ticket, basically, to go in the press box and do interviews. And you learn along the way. I thought baseball players, for whatever reason, I thought they'd be arrogant. I thought they'd be standoffish or dismissive of a kid. And you know what? Treat them with respect. And guess what? They're human beings, and they give you respect in return. It's a really easy concept. And the players, for the most part, were great to deal with. I used to talk to Tony Gwynn every year when he would come to town with the Padres. And Tony, one time, I was in my first year at Vanderbilt, my last year doing the magazine, and I was wearing a Vanderbilt shirt. And Tony, we're sitting in the dugout at the visiting side of the vet. And Tony Gwynn says, "You go to Vanderbilt now?" I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Our beat writer went to Vanderbilt. You got to meet him. I got to introduce you guys. You'll get along." I was like, "What a nice thing to do." And he had nothing in it, just a goodwill gesture. And that beat writer's name was Buster Olney. I had never met Buster. I didn't know what a Buster Olney was. But I met him. We became friends through the Vanderbilt connection. And then 5 years later, Buster's career has taken off. He's working for the New York Times, and he tells his sports editor, "Hey, there's a kid covering the Angels out in California. He might be a good prospect for us someday." And I talking to the sports editor, got my foot in the door at the Times. I got hired when I was 24, 25 years old, and I've been there for 20 years. So a lot of that was just, Tony Gwynn taking a liking and just playing matchmaker. So I'm lucky. I've had a lot of good experiences in the game. I feel like I say this in the book that I've never been jaded by the game. My favorite movie is Almost Famous because it reminds me of what it was like to cover the thing you really love at a really young age, and seeing the warts and seeing the underside of it and still saying, you know what, I'm in. I see it, and I'm not going to lose my youthful enthusiasm. I see the reality. I cover the reality, but you know what? This is the world I want to be in. I'm not like those rock stars. I'm not like those players. They have a skill that I'll never have, but what I want to do is understand it better. I want to know how they got that skill. Not thinking that I can ever do it, but just I'm endlessly fascinated by it. Another thing that Tony Gwynn would tell me is that he said, every day I come to the ballpark, I get excited because I'm going to learn something new today. And I know that I'm going to leave the park knowing more about baseball than I did before I got here. And I thought, oh, my God, he's got 7 or 8 batting titles. He's going to the Hall of Fame. If Tony Gwynn can learn something new about baseball every day, then I will never stop learning about it. Every time I walk into the stadium and get a chance to talk to these players and watch what they do, I'm going to learn something new. And that was a really kind of liberating feeling, just to know that if I'm around baseball, and I certainly plan to be, as a career, I will never stop learning. And that's the fun thing about being a baseball writer, is that every time I'm around these guys, and now increasingly the front office types who have really interesting approaches to how to build a team and what formulas will help you win in this data-driven age, I learned something. I learned something from the front office, from the scouts, from the players, but particularly the pitchers. The pitchers have always been my favorite aspect of the game. The control they have over what happens in the game, right? Like the batter, as great as they are, that's as freakishly skilled as those hitters are, they're just reacting to what the pitcher decides, right? Every pitch is a decision. And I've always been interested in why they throw a certain pitch And, because the pitcher has three decisions really, is what to throw, where to throw it, and why. And which weapons do you have to use? Mike Mussina was a guy I covered for the last 7 years of his career with the Yankees. The first 8 years that I covered the Yankees for 8 years. They were Mike's last 7 and then one more. I won't tell you what happened in that one because it was 2009 and they ended up beating but Mike Mussina had so many. He wouldn't have to do about it either because he retired 1 year too early. He didn't get a ring. But he had so many weapons to use. He was another, like me, he was a right-handed pitcher from Pennsylvania who wanted to make it big, but he was really talented. And he also was really, really innovative. And he tried every different pitch. He would look at that baseball and think of all the different ways he could make it spin and break. He was always asking questions. How did you throw this? How did you learn this? How do you improve it? People think he threw a knuckle curve, but really he only threw that a little bit. The curveball he actually threw was one he learned at Stanford University, because he's like, this is better than what I was throwing. He took a cell phone when I'm interviewing. He's like, why would you talk on a rotary phone when you have this? He's like, I just kept improving it and trying to find new ways and new weapons to get guys out. And so that's really what the book is ultimately about. It's how you learned your best pitches and how you applied them. But I think it's the greater point of it was about the search for excellence and the search for just ways to be the best possible version of yourself, and how you never, if you're a pitcher and you have the baseline skills of being a professional athlete and being able to throw a certain speed, you just never give up until make them rip the uniform off you. Before I get kicked out the door, I'm going to try to throw a knuckleball. I'm going to try to throw a sidearm. I'm going to try something to stay in this game. And sometimes you might come up with a pitch that keeps you around or sends you to the Hall of Fame. So these last 3 years, the 3 years I worked on the book, early 15 to early 18, everywhere I went while covering baseball for the Times, I would keep my radar up. Is there anyone on these teams in the broadcast booth, in the coaching ranks, anywhere in the ballpark today who threw one pitch particularly well? Okay, it's the Twins are in town. Twins are in Boston. Who's their broadcaster? Bert Blyleven. He had one of the greatest curveballs ever. It's a doubleheader. I'm here at the ballpark early. Oh, is that him over there in the broadcast booth? Okay, knock on the door. Bert Blyleven, this is Tyler Kepner. I'm working on this book. I want to write about the history of the curveball for a chapter. I got to talk to you. You had a great one. Sit down with Bert Blyleven for 20 minutes and talk about curveballs. Record it, listen to it, put it in my curveball file, and then somehow fold that into the history of that pitch. Talk to hitters. Okay, again, that same series, the Minnesota Twins, their manager was Paul Molitor. I look him up, look up his stats. Who did he hit well or poorly against? Well, he really couldn't hit Ron Guidry. Guidry had a great slider. I'm planning to talk to Guidry about his slider. I asked Molitor, how did you were such a great hitter. What gave you trouble about Guidry's slider? And he said, you know what? I would know. The thing that killed me about Guidry's slider is I knew it was coming. I would see the third baseman. I'd see Greg Nettles out of the corner of my eye take a step toward third base because he'd get the signal from the shortstop. The shortstop could see the sign, know that a slider was coming. So Nettles would take a step toward third, expecting me to pull the ball. And I knew the slider was coming, and I still couldn't hit it, and that's how great Guidry was. And so you get little anecdotes like that, and they just pile up, and they build on each other. I did over 300 interviews, a lot of them that way, a lot of them just planned out. I always tried to have a line or two in the water, just, a phone call, an email out to someone's publicist or agent or a team PR rep or an alumni person for a team and explain what I'm doing and say, you know what, Ken Singleton told me that he was a great player for the Expos and Orioles. That Ken Singleton told me that Scott McGregor had the greatest changeup he ever saw. And I'm like, well, I saw Scott McGregor pitch a shutout to beat the Phillies in the World Series when I was 8 years old. You don't tell me about Scott McGregor. He's caused me many years of mental trauma. But I've moved past that most of the time. And so I asked the Orioles, how do I get in touch with Scott McGregor? And they put him on the phone for me, and we have a wonderful conversation about the changeup, and that goes in the book. So as you can see, for someone like me, with the background I described to you, that kind of a scavenger hunt for 3 years was really, really fun. And a lot of authors will say that writing a book is just torturous and it's so difficult. And maybe because I had 3 years to work on it, and maybe because I just couldn't not write it once I came up with the idea, but it was a lot of fun for me. It was probably the most fulfilling professional thing I've ever done. I've compared it to being a carpenter who makes makes lecterns or bookshelves or beds, and just has a nice, solid, steady living, making things, useful things around the house. But I just want to apply those same skills to building a house, something lasting, something where you can drive past and say, I built that house. It's been standing for 50 years or whatever. And it's the same thing. I write articles and I take a lot of pride in them, and mostly they're fulfilling. But I always wanted to write something lasting, something with my name on the spine that you can put in a library like this and have it be there forever and have it stand as, hopefully, if I did a good job, a definitive work on the craft of pitching. So it's pretty cool to have done that, and it's just, I can talk all night about all the people. I interviewed 22 Hall of Fame pitchers and a bunch of Hall of Fame hitters. Mike Schmidt, asking just one anecdote from Mike Schmidt. What am I going to get? He talked about Nolan Ryan's curveball. Sometimes you'd find an old player and say, like, what was the single toughest pitch you faced? And Mike Schmidt will get up and start telling you, in the lobby of the Phillies spring training in Clearwater, and he gets up there and he's showing me what it's like to bat against Nolan Ryan's curveball. And I'm like, wow. And then I'll ask Ken Griffey Sr. the same question, and he'll be like, yeah, there was a guy named Bob Shirley, and he had a slider that was really, really tough. And I'm like, I can't really do a whole lot with that. But I did want to talk to some of the Bob Shirley types. I didn't talk to Bob Shirley, but I talked to guys who are not Hall of Famers, but who threw one pitch really well, like a guy named Doug Jones, who was a closer. He pitched 1 year for the Phillies, actually. He was the all-star closer in '94. He was the replacement for Mitch Williams, if you remember him. They got him from the Astros. But Jones was a guy, he played mostly for Cleveland, and then he started bouncing around, but he had an incredible changeup, and he was a great storyteller to talk about, like, how other people would try to throw the changeup, and they didn't really want to learn it because they weren't willing to be as patient as you need. And then I'd learn what the mindset it took to throw a changeup, and I'd interview a bunch of guys, and this Johnny Padres' name kept coming up. He was a Phillies pitching coach, among other teams, and I could trace the lineage of that pitch from Johnny Padres, who threw it to win the World Series for the Brooklyn Dodgers, to some of his proteges like Frank Viola, who threw it to win the World Series for the Twins. And then a guy who Johnny taught it to with the Dodgers, taught it to Pedro Martinez, and Pedro threw it to win the World Series for the Red Sox. And things like that, just, Pedro's inspired a lot of kids in the Dominican to start learning the changeup. And Kelvin Herrera was one of them, and he helped the Royals win the World Series. So you can just trace through that pitch the Brooklyn Dodgers to the Twins to the Red Sox to the Royals, all these World Series that we, the diehard fans will remember. You can just sort of trace it all the way back. And that was a big part of it for me too, the passing down of pitches through the generations. And you realize that players aren't paid to know about history. That's what I'm paid to know about, but they're part of it, and they make it. And they appreciate the people who came before, a lot of them do, and the knowledge that they can have, and passing it down is sort of part of their responsibility. So getting to know the mindset of the players and how they pass, how they sort of continue this game and pass on this game was another fascinating part of it and really rewarding for me. So,
can you comment on, do you have any theories on why there are so many injuries to pitchers these days, much more than when I started watching baseball, when I was watching it when Johnny Padres won that World Series, actually.
Were you really?
Before that.
Yeah.
But I don't remember pitchers going down like they're going down now, and they pitch more innings with less rest.
Yeah. I try to get into the injury factor in a lot of the chapters about the particular pitches, right? The injury fears about throwing a curveball or throwing a splitter. But the sort of the global picture, the big picture of the injuries, is something that the baseball industry has been trying like heck to figure out what's going on. I think part of it is just being able to identify injuries that science and technology couldn't identify in the past. You'd try to pitch through something, and maybe you could, or maybe you wouldn't, and you would just never be heard from again. Part of it could be that a lot of the guys who threw the 300 innings that we think about, that I remember, from Steve Carlton being my favorite all-time pitcher, last guy to throw 300 innings, Steve Carlton and those kind of guys may have been outliers. Maybe there are some guys who could do it now. Jim Palmer would say, yeah, sure, you can look at my record and see all the times that I threw 300 innings or 280, but what about all the pitchers I came up with the baby birds, the Orioles in the early 60s, and they got hurt and they blew out their shoulders, never heard from again. He told me about a guy, actually his daughter got in touch with me on Twitter after she read something, and his name was Harden, Jim Harden, and Palmer was telling me a story about how Jim Harden had a great season, but but his one-loss record wasn't great or something, and so the Orioles didn't give him a raise because they were cheap and players had no power, and so Jim Harden had to go pitch in the Winter League after he'd already pitched a whole lot of innings that year just to try to make some money, and he blew out his arm, and he was never really the same. And it's better now for pitchers. It's better that the teams care more about their arm health. Maybe they care too much. Maybe they baby them, probably. But I think on the whole, that's a better approach than the old days when they would just, rub some dirt on it and go get them. And if you blow out, then next man up. I mean, I don't have this in the book, but Al Leiter had a nice long career, but he had a lot of injury problems early on because Dallas Green, who I understand obviously was a saint in Philadelphia for winning the World Series, Dallas Green was an old-time baseball guy, hey, you're gonna go out there and pitch and tough it out. Al Leiter was a kid, and he's throwing 150 pitches in the game before he's ready, and it took him a bunch of years to get back on track with his arm. So, I hear you. I love old-time pitchers, but I think nowadays they're trying to err on the side of keeping these guys healthy, and whenever at the first sign of any injury, they're going to shut them down. It's all in the name. It's a paradox, right? Because it's all in the name of keeping them healthy, but a lot of times they back off and they wind up with fewer innings and more injury problems. So, it's a big topic and something the whole industry is thinking about for sure. I don't know if that answers your question. It probably doesn't, but some of the factors are involved. Well, the part of the physical thing is they've actually largely solved the shoulder issues because there are protocols that you can follow that you don't see pitchers having nearly as many shoulder problems as before. It's all the elbow stuff because you can't really strengthen those ligaments, and the harder and harder you throw, it's eventually you're going to break if you don't, if you're not sort of a bionic body.
Hello, thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
In your curveball folder, do you have any research about the Harvard president who was wondering whether Harvard baseball players should throw a pitch that would deceive batters and wondering if that was a quality that Harvard should teach its people?
The ethics of deception, right? Well, it is funny. I may have come across that somewhere in my research. I don't know if I don't think it made it in. But a couple things about that was that one thing that amazed me was that in the early days, there was that question of whether a ball actually could curve. They were always setting up rudimentary experiments in gymnasiums in the offseason, putting poles here and having a pitcher, old Hoss Radbourn, come in and throw the ball around a pole to prove definitively that the baseball could curve. So I think probably in way back then, a lot of people didn't believe it could curve, and the pitcher, remember at the very beginning, was just a functionary. The hitter was like, I want to throw it up here or throw it down here, and there was baseball originally was not intended to be about pitching. Joe Madden, the manager of the Cubs, Pennsylvania native, would say, he says, it ought to just be called pitching because that's really what it is. Pitching, we just respond to the pitcher. But back then, the pitcher was just basically putting it on a tee in the air, saying up here or down there, and it was a test of hitting, fielding, and base running. So I can understand why that would be a theory, you're changing the game if you're trying to deceive the hitter. The whole point is to put it where the hitter wants it, and then let's get some action going. And that's one of the things baseball struggles with now is that there's more strikeouts than hits, and there's more foul balls than balls in play because pitchers just keep evolving and getting better and better. All the technology's helping pitchers, have better command and better velocity and all this stuff. So yeah, it really goes to that theory or that line of thinking does go to the root of the beginnings of the game.
This is a three-part question. Who are your favorite sports writers other than Jason Stark? What are your favorite baseball movies and baseball books?
Ooh, great ones. Jason's always been my favorite, but there's so many good ones. Roger Angel's the greatest essayist who ever lived. When I was in college, this sounds so primitive, but I would, to reward myself kind of for studying, getting through exams, I would go photocopy some of Roger Angel's old season-ending pieces from the New Yorker. Like he'd write like an 18-page New Yorker essay on the 1982 season or something, and then I would save that for when I was all done and read it on the plane coming home. I love Roger Angel's books. He's a wonderful guy. He's still around, and he's like the Vince Scully of our profession. There's just no one who can put words together quite like Roger Angel ever has. So, I mean, Tom Verducci's just a legend in Sports Illustrated. He's incredible. I've really taken to a lot of these guys in The Athletic, the app. Matt Gelb does an amazing job here covering the Phillies. Just think of it locally. But there are so many guys whose work I really like. Those are a few. George Will, again, he blurred my book, but I mean, Men at Work and Ball 4 were my two favorite books, probably on baseball ever. And I read them both the same year when I was 15. It was the 20th anniversary edition of Ball 4 in 1990, and that was the year that Men at Work came out. And so I felt like Men at Work got me as deep as possible on the technical side of what happens on the field. And Ball 4 told me everything I could want to know about the personalities and the human side of it and the humorous side of it. And those two books kind of set me off on my career, basically, on my journey, knowing that, the human side and the technical side, and putting them together like that. So my favorite movies, I think the mid-'80s had a lot of good movies right at the same time, a lot of good baseball movies. The Natural, Major League was a funny movie toward the end of the decade. Bull Durham was great. Field of Dreams. But I guess I keep coming back to The Natural because it really takes you back in time to, the classic baseball era. And I'm not a movie, I don't know all the terminology, but I think the cinematography, you might say, of The Natural is it's so beautifully done, hitting the ball into the lights that just, and it's the complete, spoiler alert, it's the complete opposite ending from the book. But it earns it because the scene is just so beautiful. And it's based on a Philly, Eddie Waitkus, so at least part of it. So I would say that would probably be my number one baseball movie, and though I gave you the books. And, Jason's the tops for me, but Roger Angel, Tom Verducci, it's hard to get much better than those guys. Oh, and Dan Shaughnessy in the Globe, too. I love reading him. Anything he writes, the Boston Globe, he's a legend.
Do you have any anecdotes regarding Bartolo Colon? The man is almost 50 years old. He weighs close to 300 pounds, and he's still pitching professional baseball.
Well, he's not in the big leagues this year, though, which now that if he is retired and Ichiro's retired now, I'm suddenly older than everybody in the big leagues. So I was rooting for Bartolo to keep going as long as he could. Bartolo never did many interviews, even in Spanish. Like, he just wasn't the kind of guy who was too into talking. But to watch him pitch was – the thing that fascinated me about him was how when he came up and he was throwing 98, and then by the end, he was not a hard thrower, but he still threw almost all fastballs. And he just showed what you could do with command of a two-seam fastball. How to throw it, how to make it multiple pitches by spotting it so well. Teammates love him. He was just kind of obviously a big character of the game, especially when he went to the Mets, hitting the home run and getting them helping them get to the World Series. And they'd have all these great young pitchers who, we talk about the injuries. These guys look big and strong, and they're always breaking down. And it's big, tubby Bartolo who's there, who's indestructible. And who knows what he's really been doing? He had a PED suspension one year. Who knows what he's putting in his body? But somehow he was able to do it year after year after year. Most wins of any Latin American pitcher of all time. He's not going to make the Hall of Fame, but he's got a pretty good legacy. And I can't say I ever got to know him too well because he, like I said, didn't like to talk too much. But just being in his orbit was pretty funny. The teammates loved him though, because a friend of mine on the Post wrote something about Bartolo Colon tested positive for peanut butter or something like that. Some cheap shot, but it was funny. And then the teammates froze that guy out for a day. They were like, we're not going to talk to anybody if that guy's in the clubhouse, because that was how much they respected Bartolo. They didn't want you taking a cheap shot. And they smoothed it over, but it was just they loved that guy. They did.
So given your coverage over the last 25 years, who do you think are the best two lefties and the two best righties?
The two best lefties, two best righties the last 25 years? Takes us back to 93. So in that era, well, it's three righties and one lefty, but there were four guys who stood out so much in the steroid era because it was such an offensive era. And you had Randy Johnson, Greg Maddux, Pedro Martinez, and Roger Clemens were so good in comparison to the rest of the league. Now, not all Hall of Famers need to be that caliber. I mean, Mike Messina is a Hall of Famer, and there's a bunch of like Tom Glavine. But those four really, I mean, their stats in an offensive-heavy era really stand out. Now, there's only one lefty in that, so maybe Glavine would be the second best lefty in that time. I find Jamie Moyer to be fascinating because, you know, he's not going to make the Hall of Fame, but, I mean, he's from Souderton. We played in a lot of the same fields. We could talk about stuff. We threw about the same miles per hour as I do in the media games. But Jamie, to pitch, really, think about it. I put a picture, the photo I use of Jamie in the book is with the Colorado Rockies because that was 2012. Jamie turned 50 years old that year, and he won a Major League game. He had Tommy John surgery when he was 47, and he's like, no, I'm going to rehab it and come back. And everyone's like, are you crazy? Like, I was doing an interview in the Rockies clubhouse one time, and Jason Giambi, who I loved, was on the Rockies, and he walked by Jamie. He goes, hey, Jamie, you're still playing. Why do you hate your family so much? Like, just go home. You've made money. He's laughed at everything. And Jamie had 8 kids. Maybe that was, you know. But I found Jamie as a lefty to just be, again, not the best, but certainly the most dogged competitor and the guy who got the most out of whatever he had. He was in incredible shape, but he was also just an incredibly gutsy pitcher who didn't throw much more than 80, but he would go inside on you. I wanted to talk to him about fastballs and changeups, but because you got to have some nerve to throw 80-mile-an-hour fastballs in there to some of those big hitters, but he did. And to watch him at his best, now he knew he gave more home runs than anybody in baseball history. So he knew that he made a mistake and it's going to go a long way, but he didn't care. He'd just go right in there because he had to get in there to get away. And I thought he was a great example of, of pitching for anybody who wanted to pay attention. So.
I heard you the other day tell a great story about Mariano Rivera and Roy Halladay, and I wondered if you'd tell us that again.
Oh, sure, yeah. You know, when I covered the Yankees, Halladay pitched mostly for Toronto, and no pitcher could make the Yankees hitters look as feeble as Roy Halladay. The Yankees hitters were really, really good, and it felt like they were always getting the ball off the end of the bat or on the handle for weak contact. So I was always fascinated by Roy Halladay, and getting a chance to talk to him after I'd pretty much given up. After he retired, he didn't have a whole lot to do with organized professional baseball for the first couple of years. But the Phillies remembered that I had wanted to talk to him, and in 2017, he was back working for them, and I got an interview with him. And we were talking about, again, this is about like the search for excellence. He was already on the All-Star team in 2008 at Yankee Stadium, but he felt like he didn't have quite the repertoire he needed. He felt like he needed a better cutter, and something was wrong with his cutter. So he was talking to Mariano Rivera about how Rivera threw the cutter, and Rivera showed him his grip, and Halladay noticed that his thumb was in a different position than Roy's thumb was. And Roy would keep his thumb here, and he said that it would get in the way, essentially, of the ball veering left like that, and that Rivera always remembered to tuck it underneath, and so the ball was really overloaded to this side, and it would just, it had that unimpeded kind of late breaking shift. So for the rest of his career, he immediately went in and took a baseball and traced his fingers around it to make sure that he would always sort of have a cheat sheet for if he ever went back to his old habits. And for the rest of his career, if he felt himself going back to his old habits, he would go to that Rivera traced baseball and remember how to throw a cutter. And he used that cutter in 09, 10, 11, the next 3 years, more than any other starter in baseball. And he was never better. I mean, if without those 3 years, he probably doesn't have quite the longevity to get into the Hall of Fame. But he did, and he made some amazing memories for fans in this town and really added to his legacy. And the kicker of the story was that the Yankees, he kept beating the Yankees. And the Yankees, had a little kangaroo court, for various little infractions. And they fined Rivera for helping the enemy learn his pitch. But that was Rivera, and that's what a lot of pitchers do because they know that, he can show – great pitchers can show each other grips, but it still doesn't guarantee that they're going to be able to throw it. I mean, John Smoltz would tell me about how frustrated he was to play with pitchers who threw great changeups, and he could never throw a changeup. He was a tremendous athlete, Hall of Fame pitcher, but he couldn't learn Tom Glavine's changeup. His physiology was different. But Halladay's, it did match up, and Rivera was sharing secrets with the enemy.
Yeah, either, within the book or just throughout your career, I'm interested as far as the pitchers with the relationship and whether any good insight from some catchers that had to do, with some of the success of the pitchers and just that relationship.
Yeah, I did talk to quite a few catchers. Some I planned out, some I didn't. I saw Ted Simmons at a game once, and I started asking him about Bruce Sutter and why Bruce Sutter's splitter just acted differently than other guys, and he gave me a great visual of the action of Sutter's pitch versus other guys. But one catcher I really wanted to get was Tim McCarver, because again, my favorite player was Steve Carlton, and I talked to Lefty for 40 minutes, which was a huge thrill for me. But I had to talk to McCarver to kind of fill in the gaps, and because McCarver is so loquacious and so enthusiastic. The old story about McCarver is that he and Carlton were going to be buried 60 feet 6 inches apart because they were inseparable. But one story that I loved, and I had to include it even though it wasn't really about the slider, but I just put it in there, and thankfully they let me. I justified it because it was sort of about how Lefty was, intellectually just, even if it was unusual, he knew what he was doing. And McCarver told a story about how they went on a hunting trip once, and they drove from here to the Dakotas to go hunting. And as they were packing up the car, McCarver found a caulking gun in the trunk. And he said, "What do you need this for?" And Lefty's like, just leave it back there. Maybe we'll need it. And they're driving across the plains, and a pheasant flies into the front of Lefty's Ford Bronco, whatever car it was, Chevy Blazer. And so it gets stuck in the grill, and it's leaking antifreeze, and they stop the car, and Carlton goes, "I've got just the thing." And he goes back to the trunk, and he gets the caulking gun out, he removes the bird, and he caulks up the front of the Blazer. And it's like, all right, we go on our way. And Lefty sold the Blazer 8 years later with the caulk still intact. And McCarver said, "I'll never doubt you again. You've got some strange kind of genius, but we're going to go with it." So I used that one. And there's some other catchers there in the book. But yeah, that was a story that stands out. You could do a whole book on catching, actually, and maybe I will someday. But
who do you consider the best pitcher? I know Carlton's your favorite pitcher, but who do you consider the best pitcher that, from all the experience that you have now with pitching?
Best pitcher of all time?
The best pitcher of all time.
Probably Walter Johnson, because Walter Johnson was so much better than... Walter Johnson held the strikeout record until 1983. Now, Nolan Ryan's probably going to hold it forever because of the innings. And I wouldn't say Nolan Ryan's the best pitcher ever. He walked a lot, and he lost a lot of games, too. He's obviously an amazing pitcher, Hall of Famer. But I think Walter Johnson, compared to his peers, the amount of times he led the league in categories. Like, we think of strikeouts now. You look at that strikeout list, and it's all pitchers from the 50s or 60s on, usually the 60s on, and Walter Johnson. And if you want, I look for durability and dominance in a starting pitcher as I evaluate those guys. And he had both more than anybody. He was doing stuff that no one else was doing back then. Now, Christy Mathewson comes really close. Christy Mathewson from Bucknell that's for you, Mike. Was really, he's way up there too. He's probably top 5. Lefty Grove in his time compared to in such an offensive era, Philadelphia A's, Lefty Grove. And some of the recent guys, Randy Johnson compared to his peers, Pedro. Pedro didn't quite have the longevity. Clemens, whatever you think of what he was doing, like he was awesome, and he's in the conversation. And I would also, you'd have to think Satchel Paige too. We don't really know how he would have matched up with the big leaguers, but I think it's pretty clear he would have been one of the best ever. And Bob Feller too. So all those guys belong in the team picture. And, if you had one game to win, it'd be hard to pick against Bob Gibson, that kind of thing. But I don't know. I'll take Walter Johnson, take my chances.
Yes, my question's of a different type. I know a young man who was college class of 2018, not from one of the big name schools like Vanderbilt, but he ended up majoring in mass communication and wanted to be a sports writer. And he's not in the Philadelphia area, but working as a freelancer for a suburban newspaper covering high school sports. and a few college sports. What kind of a future does somebody like that have in, I mean, I'm guessing a lot of guys and gals too coming up today want to be in a sports journalist, but newspapers are folding and not everybody has the talent to do broadcast. So what do you give as advice to somebody like that now?
Well, I think if someone's coming into the industry right now, I'm sure they have a lot more dexterity, versatility than maybe I did coming out, you know, where there were a lot of newspapers were in much better shape in 1997 when I got out of college than in 2018. So hopefully he would have maybe more options besides just doing, you know, newspapers, like the multimedia thing, filming, interview, you know, social media. It's tough because I don't know where the jobs are. You know, it's hard to say like go here if he's employed and he's he's a freelance basis, but if he's working, getting paid for that, that's a heck of a start because a lot of people, you know, are trying to do that. I've always believed that there's going to be room for talented people who are willing to work hard and work anywhere. You know, like if you're not bound by geography and you're not bound by having to get a big salary or something, and you're good, you know, there should always be a market for that. I can't tell you that I know where those jobs are, but the good thing about now writing is that you can just pick up and start writing on your own. You can self-publish. Anybody can, you know, just think of different ways to do things and make yourself stand out.
Thank you. Tyler, keeping it on pitchers, I know there's been a lot of mention, and it started even with the very first question about mechanics and the physical part of it. But I also know that sort of layered into baseball, maybe in the last 10 years, has been a trend toward a greater focus on the psychology of the game. I'm thinking of Joe Madden, and I'm thinking of Ken Ravizza, who he brought into the Cubs organization. Is that mostly directed on the offensive hitting side? Are pitchers their own counselors, or are they subjects or objects of working on the mental element of the game a little more so?
Oh, I think they definitely are. I mean, we talked about Halladay and how Halladay was really lost as a young pitcher. He had a mechanical reinvention, but he never would have made it back from the struggles he had early in his career with Toronto if he hadn't hooked up with Harvey Dorfman, who was a legendary, you know, sports baseball psychologist in his time. He wrote the mental ABCs of pitching. So yeah, I mean, pitching's really. I mean, the whole game is so mentally challenging. Hitters have that thing about failing 7 out of 10 times and being a success, having to accept that. You know, you hear a lot of people talk to pitchers, especially about not being able to control the results. You know, I mean, fans don't always like to hear that because it's always about wins and losses, but players they really can't get too wrapped up in the results if they do everything right. You know, you can you can do your job and guy gets a little broken bat flare and a base hit and you lose or something. You lose 1-0. That's not. I mean, Jacob deGrom last year had such a hard job to try to knowing that if he gave up 1 run, he was probably going to lose. He went 10-9, but he had a 1.70 ERA because he had like such an incredible focus every game, and that really speaks to his mental discipline. I don't know if he dealt with mental skills coaches. I know they're available in pretty much every team now. I think baseball's really come a long way in that regard. But I've never noticed that hitters need it any more than pitchers do. You know, maybe pitchers even need it more because you're all alone out there. You know, you got to decide what to do and believe in what you do. And that the mental side of it really is crazy because every pitcher will tell you that if you don't have complete conviction in what you're throwing, it's not going to be a good pitch. And that has nothing really to do with the physical execution of it. It's all your mental, you know, what your brain is telling you really does affect the quality of that pitch. If you don't trust in your decision, you're not going to make a good pitch. And I think that is a huge part of the mental training that they have to go through.
I once heard an interview with Johnny Bench, and I don't know how accurate this was, but the premise of the interview was that he always hit Steve Carlton really well. And he said that he doesn't know to this day or to that day why, but he always knew what Steve Carlton was going to throw. Did you
Wish I
talk
talked to him. I should have tried to get Johnny, right?
Pretty good. Did you talk to any hitters about reading pitchers and whether they could figure out whether they were going to get a slider or a fastball or a two-seam fastball or a changeup? Or
Yeah, a
some
lot
other
of that
kind
time, like, if a guy has a tell, eventually they'll figure it out and they'll seal up that part of the game. Like I remember last year in the playoffs, Craig Kimbrell was getting hit around, and who was it? I talked to the pitching coach, I guess, after Game 5, and Kimbrell had a good of the playoffs and of the Astros series, and he talked about how Kimbrell was doing something with his glove, and then he stopped doing it, and then they figured out that he was tipping. So sometimes that goes. It's not really chronic, but certain guys like I think Koufax had a tell on his curveball or something, but guys couldn't. They still couldn't hit him. I mean, Nolan Ryan only grunted. He grunted a lot, but he only grunted on his fastball, not his curveball. And I asked him about that. I'm like, didn't you worry that they would know what was coming if you didn't grunt on your curveball? He's like, it didn't matter. Like with him, he's like, they weren't going by the sound. They were getting, by then it's too late when you're the hardest throwing pitcher in baseball. There was one story in there about, I forget the pitcher in the spitball chapter, but like in the old days, apparently you could tell that this guy was about to throw the spitter because, like his hat would when he would spit on the ball or whatever, like his hat would tighten up on his head. Like hitters could see it because they would, I don't know. Maybe it's myth, but there are some of those in there. But that's interesting about Johnny Bench. I know he could hit Carlton pretty well. Johnny Bench was a pretty good hitter, but it's funny how some guys could just hit certain guys really well. Like I asked Messina, the hardest guy he could face. He's like, I could get this guy out or that guy out, or I couldn't get Frank Catalanato out to save my life. He could just always take what I would give him and he didn't try to do too much, go to the opposite field or something, not try to hit a home run, not get out of his swing, just, a 280, 260 hitter or something. Sometimes they owned a certain Hall of Famer. When I did the story of Mickey Morandini a few years ago when, like, who was it? Pedro, Randy, and Smoltz were maybe in the same Hall of Fame class. And, like, Mickey Morandini hit really, really well against all of them. And I got him on the phone just talking about how it was that little scrappy Mickey Morandini kind of owned these 3 Hall of Famers. It was, so that's maybe he picked something up on their delivery. I don't know.
How do you see the Phillies doing in 2019?
I picked them to win the division, so a little hometown bias there. But I think every team in the division is, except for Miami, is good. Like they're all good enough, I think, to win a lot of games. But I don't know if any of them, as currently made up, is good enough to run away with it. So I kind of think all 4 of those teams could finish anywhere from 1 to 4. But I'll take the Phillies because I don't know how you get through that lineup. I think once that lineup clicks, maybe they rely a little too much on home runs, but they can really hit. I mean, I love as great as the Harper move is. Like, the Riel Muto move was great. The Segura move was amazing. He's one of my favorite players to watch. Segura, he just puts the bat on the ball. He does a lot of good things. He's always struck me as a real grinder, a guy who gets after it. Like, I don't know. I really loved, and McCutchen, what a total pro. Like, the 4 guys they added to go from an offense last year that was last in the major leagues in hits. They're last in the majors in hits, and they still won almost half their games. I know it was a weird season, the ups and the down at the end, but to bring in those 4 guys and then to be able to get the best of, the rest, Hernandez and Franco, move them down in the order. I don't know. I think that's good. I think Noel will figure it out. And I think they'll probably add a piece somewhere along the way. Eflin, that was certainly a great sign the other day of how well he pitched. So they're all flawed. Maybe Kimbrell will make the difference, whoever gets him, if someone gets him. If Atlanta gets Kimbrell, that fixes their bullpen. If Washington adds him to somewhere in the back end mix, that helps them a lot. So he could be a difference maker. But you never know who these teams will add in trades. It's too early. But I'll stick with the Phillies because they're playing well, and that was my pick. So.
Thanks. There's a lot of talk today about the length of the game, and the batters are working the counts long, and they want to see what the pitchers have. How do you think the pitchers are reacting to that now and in the future?
I think it's a really tough issue for baseball because they want to stimulate more action in the game. They want the games to be more brisk. But a game like Sunday where a pitcher throws a complete game and there's no home runs in the game is like really rare. Like, I wonder if there had been, I was going to look that up, if there had been any others like that. Not that home runs are bad, but when you're only swinging for home runs, that, you tend to work long counts and try to get the pitcher to make a mistake. And I remember last year when the Phillies signed Carlos Santana, and Carlos is a really good player. Obviously, the fit wasn't quite right here, but Carlos Santana got that nice contract because he sees a lot of pitches. Hitters know that gets paid, that teams love that all the metrics show that that's a really effective way to win games, is to have a lineup that just is relentless and tough to get through. And that's what leads to long games, is more pitches, foul balls, and all that stuff. So there's this push and pull between wanting to make the games quicker and teams knowing that generally taking longer at-bats and stuff helps you win and gets you paid. So I really don't know how but they can do little things like get rid of the intentional walk or the pitch clock, which I don't think they're going to do, or they're not doing. But, ideas like that, I don't think it's going to make a difference as long as seeing a lot of pitches helps you win. Pitchers are trying to miss bats. There's not a lot of guys like Tommy John, Jim Cott, or Dallas Keuchel, unsigned, who are pitching to contact, or sinker guys who induce a lot of weak contact ground balls and don't care about striking many guys out. Like, that kind of pitcher is, it's harder to find. Teams don't want them. And so they want guys who can miss bats. And if they go 5 or 6 innings, that's okay, because you got other guys in the bullpen who can do the same thing. Tommy John one year gave up 287 hits in a season, and he struck out 63. Think about that. Like, 287 hits allowed and 63 strikeouts, and he was still a viable pitcher. It wasn't one of his best years, but he was still a viable pitcher. That was in my lifetime, 1984 or 3 or something. You're not going to see those kind of numbers anymore. If you're giving up 287 hits, you're going to be doing it in the independent league or something.
This question starts with the 1950 Phillies, the so-called whiz kids.
Sure.
And I know that's before your time, but it's not before mine. I have read that part of the success of that team was because of tension between the starting pitchers and the reliever, Jim Constanti.
Right.
And the story was that Constanti, when he saved a game, became completely obnoxious in the clubhouse, crowing about how he had saved the starters' bacon again.
I never knew that.
Which ticked off the starters.
Yeah.
And with the result that they did everything possible to keep Constanti out of the game. So one of two things happened. Either they pitched the complete game, kept Constanti out of the game,
right,
and presumably won it, or they faded in the 8th or the 9th, and Constanti came in. He saved their bacon again, crowed about it again, got them ticked off again, et cetera. After that long-winded preamble, my question is, do you know of any modern example of tension on a pitching staff that has had a positive effect upon a team's performance?
That's a good question. I wonder how those starters felt when didn't they start Constanti in one of the World Series games against the Yankees? Right. So he's like, not only is he a great reliever, but they're going to start him in the World Series, and I think he pitched 9 innings or something. Right. First game 1? Okay, yeah. I mean, he didn't win, right, because they got swept. But yeah, I mean, didn't he pitch 8 or 9 innings, right, or something like that? So I mean, it's a different era. I don't know that I can think offhand of a staff with a lot of internal tension. You hear about teams that it's almost a cliche. Like if there's a lot of good pitchers, they inspire each other, they push each other to try to outdo the last guy. You see certain pitchers who really don't like to come out of games ever. Max Scherzer, kind of guy like that, but inevitably they usually do. Halladay was the last guy to really throw 250, Verlander innings. Max threw 220 last year, Scherzer, and he's the only guy the last 2 years to throw 220 innings. So it's a big difference. I think they know they're all kind of in it together now. You don't usually see that that tension, or maybe I'm just missing it because I didn't know that about the Constanti question. Maybe if I think about it more, I can think of one, but can't think of a staff with a whole lot of time. The Mariners that I covered in the late '90s, they knew that bullpen was terrible. So, the Jamie Moyers and and Randy Johnson before he left, and Jeff Acero. That was a weird thing because that team just could not quite get over the hump. They had Griffey and A-Rod and Edgar Martinez, but their bullpen always really let them down. And they kept trying to address it by trades, and they ended up trading Derek Lowe and Jason Varitek one time to get Heathcliff Slocum, and I know that was a source of frustration out there because they just could never get the right bullpen pieces, and that really undermined what they were trying to do. It's probably not exactly what you meant, but that does come to mind.
Okay, thank you. This has been great. I'm sorry if I'm going back a little bit before your time, like the 1960s, maybe early 70s.
That's fine.
Pitcher for one of the California teams, Vidal Blue, his stardom and his downfall. Do you have anything on this?
What's that? Vidal Blue of the Oakland A's, yeah.
The pitcher's name was Vidal
Sure.
Blue.
Mm-hmm.
Any words on him?
He was MVP in '71, I want to say, when he came onto the scene. Cy Young MVP, amazing season. And he was really good with those Oakland teams. He had a nice revival with the Giants. I think he started the All-Star game in '78. He had some drug problems with Kansas City at the end. I didn't get too much into him. If you look at the totality of Vidal Blue's career, it actually stands up really well with like a Catfish Hunter, some Hall of Fame. He should have been a borderline Hall of Fame guy. Like, he probably didn't get enough attention for that. But I think Vidal Blue is generally remembered mostly for the 1 year. And when you do it so early, kind of like a Dwight Gooden, when you peak that early, people just expect you to kind of be a Hall of Famer. And when you don't really come close to that again, I think that kind of colors how you view a career, So I think that maybe hurt him legacy-wise, that he's remembered more for one great season than the totality of his career, which it was patchy here and there, but he had a pretty good career. But I didn't get too much into him. I mentioned him somewhere in there, but I didn't talk to him. I talked to Catfish is gone, but I talked to some people about Catfish. Talked to Raleigh Fingers during the process, not for the book, but during one of the World Series games. But I didn't get too much into Vidal Blue, but that's kind of how I think of him. Great leg kick too. He was a very big high leg kick, and his delivery, and a lot of fun photos of him. But anyway, so that's all right. We're all baseball people. We could talk all night, right?